I think if you're living at about 2/3 of an atmosphere of oxygen from sea level, I think it does weird things for your brain. But also the cold and the wind. I mean, they would get cabin fever in a stone house, the stone signal station at the top of the peak, because they would be trapped in there just for a long time. And then sometimes the electrical activity would be just incredible and horrendous. The things that they'd see in the sky, the emanations from the planets and aurora borealis, it was just strange. It was just so strange as to be different than I think living anyplace else. And it was tough. It was very hard for them to live there. The signal station and Colorado Springs started in the same year, in 1873. The Signal Corps, after the Civil War, was putting signal stations all over, opening signal stations all over the United States. They'd had requests, the government had, and the Congress had, requests for weather forecasting, especially for the agricultural industries and for the shipping industries, especially on the Great Lakes. Because if they didn't know when big storms were coming, they could lose everything. And Mount Washington in New Hampshire was the first signal station to be established at high altitude, and Pikes Peak the second. They knew that it was a very windy place, and they wanted to be doing the meteorological aspects of wind and measurement and behavior and so forth. That and a reason that Pikes Peak was way out away from a lot of other mountains, and it was much easier to get to than almost any other high peak in Colorado, were the reasons that the station was established there. They were sending regular weather forecasts to the east. We all know that weather in general terms moves across North America from west to east and everywhere in the northern hemisphere. So they had a pretty good vantage to be able to look to the west and then see what was coming and what finally got to Pikes Peak, and to give people a pretty good heads up about what was going on. And their first clients, really, the first ones to be able to feel the impact of what they were forecasting, were the people at the foot of Pikes Peak and the people along the Front Range of Colorado. Colorado Springs was tiny, and they had a national audience. So they were not just reporting on the weather, they were reporting on the strange phenomena that they were observing, including some of the natural phenomena, like one day they saw a bison at the very top of Pikes Peak. And that really makes you wonder. So they were reporting these things, sending them west, and they really were sort of like the first visitors bureau or chamber of commerce, sort of sending out information that would attract people to come, tourists and otherwise, to come to the Pikes Peak region. That's something, of course, that just really started a ball rolling that's been going ever since then, because we've always been a real tourist destination. One of the things that were sometimes telegraphed were the tall tales that were created and reported. If you can be straight-faced over a telegraph line, they were reported in semi-believable ways, and some of those not just traveled across the country, they traveled and were picked up by newspapers in Europe, in Canada, and people started to wonder about the safety of the signalmen at the top, for they were all men in those days, the signalmen at the top of Pikes Peak, and about the strange environment. Maybe some of those tall tales chased some people away, I don't know. But at any rate, those were an attraction. And reading a collection of short stories, of excerpts from Colorado history, I came upon a guy named Sergeant John O'Keefe, who was the sergeant in charge of the signal station at the top of Pikes Peak for what was called the Signal Service, or now called the Signal Corps. And John O'Keefe, I found out, was quite a prevaricator. He would make up wild stories. He and a partner of his, drinking partner of his, down in Colorado Springs. And one of those was about some Rocky Mountain rats that, unfortunately, ultimately, when they attacked John O'Keefe and his wife Nora, they devoured their poor daughter Erin. And he wasn't married, and he had no children. And it was all a tall tale that he made up under the influence of very thin atmosphere at the top of Pikes Peak. There were always 2 or 3 enlisted people at the station, and always a sergeant in charge. And the first one was Sergeant Robert Saboth, who was a German immigrant. I would have loved to meet him. Sounds like a really well-organized, fantastic guy to get things going at the top of Pikes Peak. And Saboth was also very good with PR. So with the community of Colorado Springs, the little community in Manitou Springs at the bottom of the mountain, but also because they were sending their forecasts and other messages about weird and wonderful things and horrible things that were happening at the top of Pikes Peak all the way to Washington, D.C., he was really sending out messages to the whole nation. He created the first tall tale about living at the top of Pikes Peak, a story about a lake monster in the lake that we now call Moraine Lake, on the trail that they used to get to the top of the peak. And then some of the others, especially Sergeant O'Keefe, carried on the tradition. The signal station, which was a little stone building that leaked air and snow, even though it had 18-inch thick rock walls. And it had a roof that threatened to lift off with high winds unless there were tons of rocks put down on top of the zinc sheathing, the roofing material that was there at the top. And if you think about that, now think about this year and in the next few years to come, when they're going to be building a new summit house at the top of Pikes Peak. And think about that first summit house, and think about the design, whatever the design that's going to be chosen for the summit house is going to be. And there's one wall still standing there from the summit house, and it's going to be, I hope, continue to stand and be part of the interpretive exhibits and part of a story that started in 1873 that's going to continue right on into the future when people come to the summit house, just like they would come to the signal station. Sometimes the summit house was overwhelmed with tourists, not the number we see today, but a few here and there would make the place really crowded, especially if the weather was turning bad. People had to stay overnight in a 2 small room stone building. There are the similarities that are going right through to today, and I'm really hoping they're going to interpret the Signal Corps and the tall tales and the weather observers and the lives that they live, because I think they're a fascinating story today or way back when they were living them.